As promised, we're going to keep things practical here, and we're now going to implement a new feature. We're going to start by implementing it without TDD in this video, and then in the next video we're going to use TDD, and then we will compare the results. Alright, so this will be our little demo application for today, and we're going to work on a podcast platform. We are here inside a level application, but it doesn't matter which PHP framework you are using. I have already prepared a little task for us inside this to-do list, so let's check this out. We want to make sure that we can publish a podcast. There will be a request to an endpoint, so we are only dealing with the backend side of this task. Then we want to make sure that a podcast was marked as published in the database, and we want to set out a podcast was published email. That's our goal for today. Alright, there are now a few ways how we can start this by thinking first about the endpoint, but maybe there's a controller. I know already there will be a controller, but maybe the code could be also inside an action or service class, or do I start with a mail? Yeah, so we have multiple options here, but what I like to do is start here with a new route. So let's start with a new route here. I already know that this will be a post request, probably from some kind of form or submit button. In the endpoint, let's copy this here. Podcast, then the ID of our podcast, and then publish. I already know that in Laravel I want to get here an object of the actual podcast, and I can do this by referencing the model, which is called podcast, which we already have in this application. Okay, this means next we want to connect this route with a controller, but we don't have a controller yet, so let's create a new one. I'm using here a plugin which helps me to create some of those classes, and we're going to call this publish podcast controller. And we already have here an invoke method, so we don't want to use any other methods here. In Laravel, this already works here by just referencing here our controller class. And let's clean this up to make this a little bit nicer here. Alright, so we're going to trigger a post request to a specific endpoint here. We are going to get a specific ID of the podcast we want to publish, and then this will be translated to a model which we then get automatically to our controller here by just referencing it here. Like this. Okay, what else do we need here? Yeah, maybe it's also a good idea to give this now a name, because every time we reference a route, we want to use this by a specific name, which is easier, so we can change the endpoint, but the name will stay the same. So how we're going to call this? Podcast publish. Yeah, I think that's already a good name. All right, next inside our controller, this is the method that will be triggered automatically. What do we want to do here? So first, of course, we want to publish the podcast. That's our main goal. But then the second task is also to send an email to the user. Let's start with publishing the podcast. We already have an instance of the right podcast. Now I'm going to call the update method to update the status of our podcast to be published. And as you can see, we already have here an enum class for the published and other states of our podcast, and published is what will be saved to the database. And next we want to make sure that the author knows that we have published the podcast. And to do this, I'm going to inject here a mailer service from Laravel. And then here I can use it, and I want to send an email to the author, which is the user on our podcast. And then we want to send a new podcast published email. All right, like this. Okay, and that's basically it. We have now our new endpoint here. We are marking a podcast as published when this endpoint is being triggered, and we're going to send out an email to the author of the podcast that it was published. So I guess we're done here. I haven't tested the code yet, but I think it should work. Of course, we could now write some tests to make sure that the code is working, because as we're not building the front end, it's actually not so easy to trigger the endpoint and check what it does without adding a test. But since we're now doing the same example with TDD now, I'm going to skip adding here tests, and we're going to do this in the next video.